Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for as many people as possible to join us. So a 10 or 15 seconds delay, and then we'll start this evening's fireside chat.
Okay, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone, really pleased that so many of you could join us tonight. For those of you who don't know, my name's Lucy Abraham, I'm the CEO at Glassdoor. I'm delighted to be joined by our Chair of Trustees, Rev Brian Leathard. And just really to let you know what to expect from this evening. So we'll be running for about 45 minutes or so. So we expect to finish around 6:45. If you do need to leave early, don't worry, the session's being recorded and we'll be sending it out afterwards so everyone can watch back later. Or of course, if you enjoy it so much that you just want to watch it twice, then you've got the opportunity to do that too. So we'll start off with Brian's going to say a few words and then we'll move into the fireside chat element of the night. I know that many of you have submitted questions, really delighted with the number of questions submitted in advance. So we'll try and cover as many of those as we can. There will be an opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A function within Zoom. So feel free to do that and we'll try and cover some of those questions towards the end. Any questions we're not able to cover, we will be sure to follow up on afterwards. Okay, so now over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy, and welcome from me too. I'm hugely privileged to be the Chair of Trustees of Glassdoor and delighted that you are participating in tonight's fireside chat, although whether that's a good name for what happens in the middle of June, I'm not quite sure. Every year at the end of our winter season, we intend holding a thank you event for all our volunteers, our individual and corporate sponsors, everyone who's made Glassdoor work well in the past winter, and of course, including our staff. As the number of volunteers has grown, we've always needed to extend the accommodation. And it was this year to be thanks to the Royal Garden Hotel that we would be able to host a lovely reception. Alas, that wasn't to be, but our thanks to them for having offered to host it, perhaps next year. So while we can't gather in person, we still wanted to find a means of extending a huge thank you to you, to everyone who's volunteered or joined a fundraising event or created their own event or made a donation or partnered with us or found any way to be interested in and contribute to the work of Glassdoor. It's hugely impressive and hugely scandalous. Thanks to you, we've been able to provide and advice and support to over 1,400 people this past season. We've provided shelter to over 800 individuals, and we've helped over 200 people move into hotels at the outbreak of COVID-19. In the past year, we've also helped over 240 people to move beyond homelessness into housing. So however you've been involved, an enormous thank you, not only from us, but primarily from those who have been helped by your generosity. I'm holding in my hand a copy of the latest annual report, which we'd be delighted to share with you, either electronically or in hard copy. Please just ask, it's hot off the press, and it's full of fascinating details about our work. Lucy has a couple of words of thanks also before we move into the principal activity of this evening, which is our chat and attempt to answer your fantastic, interesting and searching questions. Lucy.
Yes, I really just want to echo Brian's word of thanks to you all. I think what touches me more than anything when I've been visiting the shelters this winter is just the level of commitment, of passion, of dedication of everybody. It's only thanks to the combination of our donors, our volunteers, our drivers, all of our supporters that we're able to make everything happen. And I know that a lot of tonight's conversation is going to be dominated by COVID, inevitably. But I think I just wanted to also reflect on the fact that this is the first year that Glassdoor has run 5 night shelter circuits. Now, for those of you who don't know what a night shelter circuit looks like, that's 7 churches in an area partnering and each running a night shelter on one night of the week. We connect those with a partner day centre in the daytime, and so our guests are able to access the essentials of life during the daytime, showers, lunch, etc., and then get a meal, somewhere to sleep, and really importantly, a wonderful welcome and kindness from our volunteers in the shelters. So this year, with 5 shelter circuits, what that has meant is we have been welcoming up to 170 people every night of the winter, from November until, well, it would normally be the beginning of April. It was cut short and was until March. But that's just so fantastic. And, you know, I can't say enough how we could only make that happen thanks to all of you and your commitment and your dedication to making it work. So yeah, just a huge thank you, really.
Thanks very much indeed, Lucy. I hugely echo that. So on to our questions, which you've submitted, and they sort of fall into mainly into two areas. One is around the current situation, and the other area is around future services. You will all, as volunteers and interested persons, know quite a lot, and some of you will know details of what's been happening about things like the Everyone In scheme. But I'd like to start by asking Lucy a couple of questions that have been submitted around the current situation. One's from Penelope Evans, one's from Fernando Bregatin. A question: the government's arranged for homeless people to be accommodated as part of managing COVID risk. What are plans for the future? And from Fernando, what will happen when those currently in hotels are no longer being accommodated by local and central government? So a question about the current situation, Lucy.
Sure, yes. So for those that don't know, Everyone In was the government scheme at the end of March. They committed that due to the public health risk, rough sleepers should be moved into hotels by the end of March. And the numbers are not quite clear, but it's believed to be something heading towards 15,000 people across the whole country were put into hotels. And that included 1,400 people in centrally procured hotels in London that were being run by the GLA, the Greater London Authority. And then also local authorities across London were also running their own hotels for rough sleepers within their boroughs. So we were very fortunate, well, actually with a lot of hard work, we were the first night shelter scheme in the country to have our guests decanted from our shelters into the hotels. So that was around about 120 people right at the start of the hotel scheme. Since then, our caseworkers have been working with people that have presented new to us by linking them into the local authority hotels and the Greater London Authority hotels since then. So that's just the sort of background as to why people have been there in hotels. The question on everyone's lips indeed is what next? So the hotels are starting to close. Some hotels have closed already, and many of the London, the centrally procured London GLA hotels will be closing on a staggered basis throughout July. To be completely honest, it's been a challenge at times getting kind of clear information because there are so many parties involved. But what we've been really committed to as Glassdoor is how our caseworkers can work to support the guests in hotels to find what the next possible route into accommodation is for them, you know, knowing that this is just a temporary solution. In many ways, this has been a blessing for us in that the shelters would ordinarily end at the end of April. We'd continue working with guests coming into to see us in the office or into the day centres, but actually this has also presented an opportunity with the guests in hotels, in a safe environment, that we've been able to work with them.
And one of the ways we've been doing that, Lucy, is through providing very, very basic mobile phones for guests.
Exactly. So the first things we've wanted to do was meet their basic needs. So you know, without mobile phones, our guests are at a massive disadvantage when it comes to everything. We see it even in the shelter circuits. We see it that people aren't able to call to say that they'd like to take up the place because their batteries died or because they don't have credit on their phone. And actually giving people phones has opened up, really opportunities for them. Other basic needs like food, activities. So we provided things like magazines just to make sure that they're not isolated and bored within the hotels. And now we're able, once we'd sort of established the basic routine of how to self-isolate and what that looked like, we've spent the last few weeks working much more proactively on what are the important next steps we need to take to get each guest into permanent accommodation.
Yeah. And Faye and Joanna have asked a bit more about the timescale of that. Can you give us any definite news?
Yes and no. So in total now we've had 216 guests move into the hotels that are guests that were kind of referred in by Glassdoor. Of those, we're actively caseworking around about 100 or so. The rest of the guests are being, given advice and support by either other charities or by local authorities. Of those 100 or so, around about 25 have already, moved on from the hotels into some sort of either temporary accommodation or into private, what we call private rented sector. So where they're renting from a regular landlord. In terms of timescales for the rest, it really does vary dependent on which hotel they're in. So one of the big hotels that our guests are in Hammersmith is due to close on the 16th of July. So that's now less than a month. So obviously we're prioritising with those guests, finding them alternatives before then. It might seem relatively straightforward. If we were able to wave a magic wand, we would do. Of course, there's a whole range of challenges often that have to be overcome. The most straightforward way into housing is to get a job so that guests can then be self-supporting. But of course, at the moment, some of the avenues we would normally be using, like hospitality and catering, are not, there aren't a lot of jobs in those areas, so that becomes more difficult. Then we've got guests with possibly complicated immigration statuses, guests that are waiting on benefit claims, guests that are waiting to find out about the result of applications to become settled, so where they're EU nationals, to get their settled status. So there are lots of things which mean, timescales become quite difficult. So we're having a very active open dialogue as well with the GLA and with the local authorities about kind of progress on that. We have been reassured that on the 16th of July, if there are guests that have not yet been sort of found more permanent accommodation, then they will be moved into other hotels. So there won't be a sort of cliff edge.
Thank you. And that relates to a question which Rachel's asking. She's saying, will Glassdoor's efforts on supporting those in hotels, will that continue after that is the accommodation is closed down, or is government taking on the lead in working with those people after accommodation comes to an end?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both, really.
Right.
So, local authorities will be working closely with the guests that they've placed in hotels, but we feel a real commitment to those guests. And as I say, it is an opportunity for us in that they're safely in hotels at the moment, and we just really want to do whatever we can to support them. And an example is a guest called Mark, who joined our Richmond shelter this year. He was originally from New Zealand. He found himself in, after his dad died, he found himself in kind of various challenges, started sofa surfing, eventually ended up on the streets. because he's got very low needs, he's never been deemed as what's called priority need by his local authority. So he's never been at the top of the queue to get accommodation. But actually, one of our caseworkers has been able to help him to make that case to the local authority, and actually he's now in a staging post waiting for the next stage, and will get that accommodation. So, there have been these silver linings, and it's very important that we carry on supporting guests for as long as we can, and also supporting guests once they're in their new accommodation as well. So obviously we introduced the tenancy support worker that I think we were talking about at our event about a year ago, had just started. That's now well embedded, and we'll be looking at how we can kind of use that model even more to support the guests that are now newly housed.
Yeah, thank you. I guess this is a question that faces many people, really, because there's a certain nervousness in the community at large as lockdown restrictions are removed, and there's a relaxing. A lot of people have said that's even more scary than the sort of sudden clampdown. What are the particularities for our guests about the sort of lockdown lifting process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been, in many ways, it's been a very strange few weeks for them in general, in that they've suddenly found themselves, many of them will have been sleeping on the streets for a long time, and they've suddenly found themselves in this environment where, they've got a bed and a shower and, fantastic, but we know that for some of them, adapting into that new regime and adapting into lockdown, which, actually one of there are a few advantages of sleeping on the streets, but one of the things is that you do have a bit of a community, and in the shelters you have a community, and actually suddenly being in the hotels and being on your own in a room, that was a lot to adapt to. And I think, again, as lockdown lifts, the whole sort of situation changes again. I think it'll be hard for our guests in the same way that it's hard for all of us to keep on adapting to a new way of life.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy, and thank you to Anne for that question. If we just move on slightly to the future of our services and what the pandemic's going to mean into the next season and perhaps even beyond, Nada and others have asked a really interesting question about how we're going to run night shelters, for instance, just very practically. If the virus is still an issue, where do safety concerns lie? Is there enough room for distancing in our venues for sleeping and eating? So some very practical things about the next shelter season, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to say before delving into the practicalities is that we're expecting demand for our services to be higher than ever next winter. There's a whole raft of measures in place at the moment that the government's put in place. So things like the furloughing scheme, things like eviction prevention, things like rent holidays, that mean actually the true impact of the kind of economic side of COVID hasn't yet hit. Many of those will be lifted in September, October. So we're really expecting a whole wave of new rough sleepers then. And I say that just in context, that has to guide our thinking in terms of the services that we're running next winter. So to answer the question more specifically in terms of practicalities, of course, we're having to think through every single possibility of what the night shelters will look like if we're able to run them. At the moment, the current government guidance that is being given around guests decanting from the hotel. So the guidance that's being given to local authorities is that night shelter settings at present, while the COVID risk is still relatively high, are not suitable. They've promised that there will be some further guidance about winter night shelters, and that will be forthcoming soon. We're also working closely with Housing Justice, which is the umbrella organisation for night shelters, and they are soon to produce some guidance about what safety looks like within a night shelter setting. And of course, we've already started our own discussions as well. We've had several planning meetings already, and we'll have plenty more risk assessments around what exactly are the measures we will need to put in place to make the shelters run safely. Now, some of them are really obvious. So things like reducing capacity so that there's more space between guests, making sure that everybody's wearing PPE at all times, making sure that we're assessing people for symptoms before they enter the shelters. But then there are others, things like staggering the time that guests arrive, using a different model for volunteer rotas. There are all sorts of different modifications that we're going to make, and we'll be working on those over the next few months. But also, we're not naive, and we are being realistic that it could be that government guidance, that Public Health England says, it's not going to be possible to run night shelters in the format that we've run them in the past. So in terms of our planning, we are planning for a range of different scenarios, with the ideal situation being able to run 5 night shelter circuits again, so that we can really maximize the number of people we're able to help. But it may be that we need to make some quite significant modifications to where that works to ensure that it meets the guidance. But we're also planning for other eventualities as well. So we're looking into options around self-contained units, so things like student accommodation, so that there are lots of different options in place. There are lots of different options that we're looking at still at the moment. And of course, we will be really clear in our communication and as early as possible with churches and with volunteer teams about what that is going to look like.
Yeah, thank you. Victoria is asking, what can volunteers do now to ensure that shelters open in November?
That's a great great question, and loving the enthusiasm. I mean, we've already started conversations with all the various all our shelter venues, but I think kind of being supportive and adaptable in the way that we're able to run the service is going to be really beneficial. So anything that volunteers can kind of do in terms of supporting any case for needing to slightly adapt the service, that's going to be really valuable. And yeah, just really kind of keeping in close contact with us and watching out for the updates, and we'll keep everybody really well informed.
Yeah. I believe there was some face mask making going on as well.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, in terms of wider activities, we've put a call out for face masks for all of our guests. So on our website, you'll find details about making face masks. So yeah, the earlier we can get these made, the better, and we'll start distributing them straight away. We've had volunteers helping in other ways as well. I think, that's one of the things that I've been so delighted to see through all of the challenge in the crisis is the strength of love and support of the volunteer community. We've just had so many of you coming forward to say, what else can we do? Can we make food? Can we drive vans? Can we make face masks? And that's been really fantastic. So yes, we'll carry on keeping you involved as much as we can in as many activities as possible.
And I think it was certainly, as a clergyman, I know that it's very often our communities, and particularly the lay people in our communities, who are the ones who go on asking the awkward and difficult questions of church councils or whatever. And I would certainly encourage those of you who have the ear of community groups, the ear of church councils or whatever, to ask those awkward questions of those bodies, saying, how can we be adaptable? How can we be responsive and dynamic in our support? And often at quite short notice. I mean, we do envisage that we may have to be adaptable at very short notice come the autumn.
Yeah.
Claire asks a really interesting question. Those of you who are well versed with us will know that we have in our day shelters all sorts of activities, and we have a really profoundly important women's group in our day shelter. And there's a question about that. How can the women's group go on functioning post-COVID?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the women's group has always been a really important way for our caseworkers to engage with our female guests, often who have very much more complex situations than some of our male guests. A lot of them have sort of multiple issues that interact with each other, and the women's group is a really important opportunity for them to build trust and to really kind of get to know the women a little bit better in order to be able to help them with their situation. It's something that it's been hugely successful, and the numbers are now so great that we don't feel that at present we're able to run it safely, because we just wouldn't be able to social distance in the current venue. Yeah. We are exploring, we've got active conversations going on about moving the group to another venue, which is much bigger and would allow for the group to take place in a safe and social distance way. So we are hoping that we'll be able to get it back off the ground soon. But as I say, the most important thing is safety and knowing that we're able to do that in a responsible way. So again, we'll keep you updated.
Thank you. Clemency asks a very practical question, straightforward question. How many of our guests have suffered from COVID? Do we know?
Sure. I mean, it's quite hard to put an exact number on, mainly because you know, when we had the shelter cohort, it was very early on, and as we know, there were lots of delays around testing. So although we had quite a number of guests that were symptomatic at various times, and I think at the end, with the shelter decant, there were 3 guests that were moved into the symptomatic hotel. The only guests from the shelter cohort that we know of that had a definite confirmed case that was tested in hospital was 1 case. We have worked with a small number of guests who have self-isolated due to symptoms since then in the casework service, but we're not aware of any other sort of positive tests being confirmed.
And Catherine asks a fascinating question. She says that the Trussell Trust sees success as when they're no longer needed. How do we at Glassdoor, how do you as our CEO see success?
Well, I've got to say it's exactly the same. I mean, our vision at Glassdoor is a future where no one has to sleep on the streets of London. We shouldn't all be in jobs, as you said in the opening, Brian. It's a scandal. It's scandalous that we're all here. It's scandalous that we come back year after year. I think what we've come to realize is that we are doing such an important thing through our night shelters, in meeting people's practical needs, in giving them the love and the respect that they deserve. And then through our casework service, we're helping people to tackle issues that have often been going on for a long time, to help them on a pathway out of their homelessness. But we need to be doing more. So one of the things that we're actually sort of starting out this year is looking a little bit more about how we can be the voice of our guests. So what are we saying to policymakers? What are we saying to the public? How can we influence how things are designed to stop people ending up on the streets in the first place? So yes, that was a long way of saying we would also, like to be out of business. We would like to see a London with no one sleeping on the streets.
We would indeed. We would indeed. And every one of you is helping us get there. But it's going to be some time yet. So stick with us, please, as you hear and see of the crucial work that Glassdoor is doing with you and with our whole community. So those are some of the questions that have been asked before the meeting. I'm now going to ask Ian, one of our Glassdoor staff members, if he might read out some of the questions that have come in during the meetings, while the meeting's been taking place. Ian.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Lucy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Can you hear me okay?
We
Yeah.
can.
Excellent. So we've had some questions come in during the session. I think, Deo, we probably covered everything that you picked up on in your very good question, but we have one here from Anthony Coombs. Anthony asks, what proportion of the homeless in central London are estimated at present to have a bed, either in a night shelter or in a hotel?
That is a very good question. I'm afraid I don't, off the top of my head, know the answer, and it's rapidly changing all the time. So at one point they were saying that 90% of rough sleepers were in hotels. You know, we know that there are a large number of people every day coming through the door. So at 4:30 today, actually, we do a celebrating our achievements once a week, and we all come and talk about our achievements. And actually our caseworkers were saying again that they're seeing people coming in, you know, not necessarily because of COVID, but we're still seeing people, you know, whose relationships have broken down, the normal social issues, quite apart from losing jobs and losing homes because of COVID, you know, that they're still coming in off the streets. So yeah, honestly, I don't know what the percentage is. We can look it up and come back to you on it. But certainly it's a growing number all the time.
Yeah, I think that's the point, that it is new people turning up now, both within the normal range of reasons for homelessness, as well as those that specifically relate to the impact of COVID-19. So I think it's a double whammy really from the last 3 months, and certainly we expect that to continue. But we will try and find you the absolute number for today. But as Lucy says, tomorrow it will be different.
Of course, thank you both. We've had another question or two actually come in just in advance around the pilot for the virtual befriending scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny Allen was asking about that, as was Tim Stanley. Has that scheme been completed?
Sure, yeah. So this came about because at the start of lockdown, our caseworkers had identified that for guests, it was, you know, as I alluded to earlier, it was proving quite a lonely and difficult experience, suddenly being on their own. So we launched the befriending scheme, and we're delighted with the number of volunteers that signed up. And really, you know, those guests that have taken part have found it so helpful in terms of having that human connection. We're actually at the point now where, as lockdown starts to lift and guests are having a bit more kind of freedom to leave their rooms and to go out and about, where the need isn't currently so great, we're going to do a thorough kind of monitoring afterwards of how the scheme has gone, and look at whether or not this is something that we want to do on a greater scale in future, because it's definitely been really, really valuable for those people that have taken part.
Perhaps is it worth saying, Lucy, that the befriending, of course, wasn't face-to-face. It couldn't be. It was by telephone conversation, another really important reason for us to have provided those basic mobiles. And that also we had a support mechanism for our befrienders in place, so that if questions arose, there was an easy way for them to offload some of the impact that they were feeling from having had those conversations, or if there were very specific questions. How many volunteers did we have who are active as befrienders?
I think the latest number is about 8 or 9 that have been partnered with a guest.
Yeah.
So it was smaller than we had originally envisaged, but I think it was very important. We wanted to make sure we got the right building blocks in place. So as you say, that we had the right support mechanism. Yeah. We also made sure that all the guests that were being put forward for the scheme, you know, had been assessed in terms of their suitability for it. You know, we didn't want particularly vulnerable guests taking part. So you know, it's been an interesting learning experience in many ways, but as I say, that all of the guests and volunteers that have taken place have found it really valuable, and it will be continuing for as long as the guests are still in the hotels. We will be continuing the conversations until they're moved on elsewhere.
Thanks.
Thank you. I've got another question here, and it comes from Claire Maxwell. Claire's saying, I just wondered if you've had any difficulties with funding, as I'm aware a lot of funding routes are changing, altering significantly. And I can imagine this makes planning difficult if funding routes are closing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Claire. And again, this is my chance to thank everybody. Again, we've been absolutely bowled over by the generosity of our supporters. And, you know, it was initially, it was a huge concern, particularly as we had, you know, ambitious plans for what we did with the service this year, and how we kind of improve our capacity. And it's just been amazing to see the response that we've had, both to our immediate COVID appeal. So we put out an appeal that kind of individuals and community groups have responded to. We've had things like somebody's cycled the length of Great Britain. You know, children have been selling lemon juice and orange juice, and, you know, all sorts of wonderful responses. And we've been really, really pleased by that. But also some of our longer term partner funders who've kind of, you know, recognized that there'll be the initial additional costs, you know, so things like the phones and the food and taxis for staff, and we've had staff in hotels. So there's been a lot of initial costs, but also they've recognized that fundraising in the coming, you know, year is going to be more difficult than it has been in the past. Again, you know, once the full economic impact hits, it is going to be much more difficult for us. So we've also been really blessed in that way, that we've had some generous donors who have kind of supported us in that regard. So yeah, we're confident that we'll be able to deliver the level of service that we need to this year.
And the trustees have a policy of having reserves so that we don't have to you know, spend absolutely everything now, that we can manage our strategy into the future. And those reserves are at a level at the moment where we are confident that we can operate into next year's night shelter season on the sort of level that we hope to do, without either busting everything or getting into debt, you know, or having to close. So we're pretty confident as a board of trustees that we have the reserves to cope with that. But one of the really significant ways that you can help, of course, is to participate in the sleep out. And whether or not we'll be able to have the sleep out in Duke of York Square this October, we don't yet know. But if we can't, we would certainly be encouraging you to sleep out on your balcony, in your back garden, in your between your church pews, whatever it might be. Think flexibly and adaptively. If we can't have one fantastic huge sleep out, how can we have lots and lots and lots of small sleep outs and get us to the same place, the same result?
And at the moment, we are still planning for both scenarios. So again, we'll obviously be guided by the government guidance, but you know that the 2nd of October should be marked in your diaries for either Duke of York Square or for your virtual sleep outs at home.
Thank you. And you can register via the Glassdoor website as well at this point in time for the sleep out.
Thank you.
Too. That's quite all right. But I think we've probably got time for maybe just one more question, and maybe I can ask two in one. So Rachel Gamble said, when guests have to leave hotels, day centres will not be allowed to open. How are we planning to support our guests with their basic needs? And Victoria Lawrence asked, are any of the day centres planning on opening over the summer? So there's obviously a little bit in there about the status with the day centres and how we're planning to support our guests with basic daily needs.
Yeah, Yeah, another very good question, and something that we've been, has been exercising us for quite some time. The answer is it's different with every day centre. We're in very regular conversations with both our official partner day centres, but also with kind of all the day centres within the areas that we operate. Some are trying to look at a phased return in July, and they're just looking at how they can do that safely. Some day centres have continued running a takeaway food service throughout, so that will absolutely continue through the summer. One question that we're most concerned about is where what showers are going to look like, because obviously at the moment in the hotels guests have showers. There have been some setups where leisure centres have been able to be used for showers, but again, as lockdown restrictions lift, those kind of public shower options are going to be reduced. So it's something that we're having an active conversation with, both our partner day centres and other day centres. I know, for example, the Barents Court project over in Hammersmith and Fulham, they've used this time while they haven't been able to be open to actually do work on their building, and they've put in an extra shower downstairs and extra toilets. So yes, and we will continue to support through our casework service and through distribution of phones and underwear, socks, and all those kinds of things to support too.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that brings us neatly almost to our 45-minute sort of cut-off point. Can I just say once again, thank you very much indeed for participating tonight in this fireside chat. Keep your questions coming. It's always a delight to answer the questions. It's not onerous. We want to know what's on your minds. We want to know what you're thinking. You're the community that makes Glassdoor function as it is functioning. So please, ideas, questions, concerns, don't ever hesitate to raise them with us. We may not be able to get back to you there and then, but we will always get back to you. Please do keep on contacting us if anything that you're concerned about. Can I thank those behind the scenes, Ian and Melissa particularly, for having got this up and running. I'm the original Luddite, I think, so it's wonderful to have the technology capacity within the organisation to support this evening. Thank you to them and to everyone within Glassdoor who's made this possible. Thank you to Lucy for her fantastic leadership of our organisation. The trustees agreed to rename her post Chief Executive Officer, CEO, because of the way that Glassdoor has expanded, the way in which we're now functioning, and the way in which Lucy's role, both strategically and managerially, has grown. So we're indebted to a huge number of people for their contribution, and we are committed, as you heard us say, not only to ameliorate, but eventually to end this scandal of homelessness in our city, for we believe that no one in London should be sleeping on the streets. Thank you very much indeed, and good night from me. I'm sure Lucy will want to say good night as well.
Good night, everyone, and thank you again.
Good night.